What's the difference between a squat and a deadlift? In this video, I'm going to talk about the difference between these two movements. Lots of people get confused between the squat and the deadlift, partly because trainers teach the wrong techniques, but mainly because they are quite similar movement patterns. They both are lower body movements. They involved the hips, knee, and ankle. They're both complex multi-joint movements. So they have a lot in common, but they're also very different movement patterns. So let's get into it. The really short answer is that a squat is based on an anatomical squat, a deep squat position, which looks like this, okay? It's a movement that is based off of this movement pattern and this movement that we see in the human body. It's also called a Mexican squat, an Indian squat. It's where the way people sit when they don't have access to chairs. And most of us in the West, we've lost access to this level of mobility, but you'll see children do it a lot as well. Bums below the knees, and you can kind of rest here if you have quite good mobility. Whereas the deadlift, and there are a few different types of deadlift that I'm going to touch on in this video, but the deadlift is based off of a hip hinge, okay? So in this movement pattern, you don't see much of a knee bend, and you certainly don't see the bum going below the knees. Instead, what you see is a big hinge at the hips and just a tiny bend in the knees. The knee bend varies from a bit of knee bend in a conventional deadlift to no knee bend in a stiff leg deadlift, but at no point does the bum go below the knees. So that's the major difference between the two movements. One is based on a deep squat position and the other on a hip hinge position, okay? So they do look quite different. Now, the first place that people get confused is because a lot of trainers actually teach the squat incorrectly. They teach that you need to have parallel feet, and they teach more of a hip hinge movement where you're sending your bum back and you're not bending the knees much. In fact, they often teach that your knees should not go past your toes because it's dangerous for your knees. But this is all incorrect. And unfortunately, Pilates has a lot to answer for when it comes to teaching this kind of squat. Actually, with a squat, your feet should be about shoulder width apart and they should be turned out. But the best way to find exactly what your squat stance is for you and your body is to just get into a deep squat. And whatever is comfortable for you here, or most comfortable for you here, because it might not be that comfortable, that's your squat stance. And some people will have a wider stance and some people will have a much narrower stance, but it will always look more or less like this. In the deep squat, your bum should be well below your knees and your back should be more or less in a 45-degree angle to the floor. Although, again, there will be some individual differences. So then a squat as a strength exercise looks exactly like the deep squat. So from a standing position, once you've got that stance that's comfortable for you in the deep squat, you can start doing a squat. So bum goes down towards your ankles, back is straight in a 45-degree angle to the floor, knees go over the toes, and then you stand up from here. And this is what a basic squat should look like. It should not look like this. How deep you go in the squat depends on your mobility. Some people will have no problem, like me, going arse to grass and coming out of it. Some of you may need to use a chair, a stool, a bench, and just squat to this height. But as your strength and mobility improves, you want to try to go a bit lower, then break parallel, and then go even further before you start adding weight. A deadlift, however, is a very different movement pattern that is based on a hip hinge. As I said before, there are lots of different types of deadlifts, and I'm not going to go into each one in great detail. But I think the best place to start is with a Romanian deadlift, and you can learn this without any weight whatsoever. So you're just learning the hip hinge movement pattern where you're going from a standing position to this hip hinge position. In the bottom of this movement, my back is completely straight. There's no rounding of the spine. My knees are just a little bit bent to accommodate to help me sort of like get into the movement. And I feel a big stretch down the backs of my hamstrings. If I round my back, I don't feel the back of my hamstrings anymore. And if I bend my knees too much, I also don't feel the hamstrings. And this is the basis of a Romanian deadlift. From there, you can add dumbbells to the movement like this. You can do the same movement with a kettlebell, and then you can progress onto a barbell, but the movement stays exactly the same. A big hip hinge with a stretch down the backs of the legs and a tiny bend in the knees. Another common variation of the deadlift is the conventional deadlift. This is very similar to the Romanian deadlift, but instead of having this big hip hinge and a very little bend in the knees, we bend the knees a little bit more, and this takes the stretch off our hamstrings and allows us to use more of our quads so that we can lift more weight. I'm only doing this with a 12-kilo kettlebell, but you can also do this with a barbell. I have a separate video on the difference between a conventional and Romanian deadlift where I go through this in more detail, but that's an overview. There are other variations of the deadlift, including a stiff leg deadlift where you don't bend your knees, and a single leg deadlift where you do it with just one leg, or a kickstand deadlift where you're using the second leg for a little bit of balance and support. They are all based off of this big hip hinge movement where the bum does not go below the knees. As soon as the bum breaks parallel and goes below the knees, you're getting into squat territory. And likewise, if your squat looks like this, and your bum isn't breaking, the knees isn't breaking parallel, so this is parallel, where your thighs are parallel to the floor, then you're in deadlift territory and it's not actually a squat. In terms of which muscles they work, they're obviously both leg exercises, they're both lower body exercises, and they're both complex exercises that involve multiple muscles. But the squat is a quad dominant exercise, while the deadlift is a hip dominant leg exercise. So the squat has a focus on the quads. It still works your glutes, your hamstrings, your calves, and your back muscles if you're loading it correctly, but the focus is on the quads, whereas any form of deadlift is a hip dominant exercise. So it works the quads as well, but there's much more focus on the hamstrings and the glutes. The stiff leg and Romanian variations have more of an emphasis on the hamstrings, whereas the conventional variation has a bit more of an emphasis on the quads than they do, but not as much as the squat. There are lots of ways to load the squat. Once you've mastered the basic squat through full range of motion, you can use a dumbbell at the chest. This is called a goblet squat. You can rack dumbbells at your shoulder, and this is called a racked squat. You can use a barbell on your back, and this is called a barbell back squat. And you can even throw the barbell overhead and do what's called an overhead squat. But in every single one of those variations, the technique of the squat is exactly the same. Same foot width apart, same position at the bottom of the movement, same position at the top of the movement, same depth, exactly the same movement, no matter how you load it. A lot of people, as they add more weight, tend to make the squat shallower. You want to make sure that you're still breaking parallel. And if your mobility isn't good enough to break parallel, you want to keep working on it to get your squat deeper rather than adding weight. That's it. That's the basic difference between the squat and the deadlift, with a few examples of different variations and different loading and a few common mistakes. I'll link below my tutorial on a squat and on the difference between a conventional and Romanian deadlift. But the big takeaway is that every single squat is based off of this deep anatomical squat with a big bend at both the knees and the hips and the ankle. And any variation of the deadlift is based off of the hip hinge and very little knee bend. I hope you found that helpful. Any questions, ask them below, and any requests for more tutorials like this, please pop them below as well.